This is Carly Madison Gregg, who is in court in Mississippi.
Sentences will be as follows. As to count one, the jury having fixed the verdict at life imprisonment, this court will sentence you to life imprisonment. As to count two, you'll be sentenced to life imprisonment. As to count three, you'll be sentenced to 10 years to serve. Beginning on the first row. Ma'am, is that your verdict? Yes. Sir, is that your verdict? Yes, sir. Ma'am, is that your verdict? Sir, is that your verdict? Yes.
It was a typical Wednesday afternoon in Mississippi, the kind of day where the sun hangs low in the sky and the world seems peaceful. But within the walls of the Smiley household, a quiet storm was brewing. 15-year-old Carly Madison Gregg had no idea that the single decision she would make that afternoon would change her life forever, and the lives of her family, including her mother, Ashley Smiley. What seemed like a moment of anger and frustration would spiral into a nightmare that no one saw coming. The scene was one of eerie calm before the violence erupted. The house was silent save for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional barking of the dogs outside. The day was warm, the air thick with humidity, but inside, Carly stood in her bedroom, her thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and rage. Her mother, Ashley Smiley, had just returned from work, no idea what awaited her. After hearing that Carly had been abusing marijuana, Ashley had gone straight to her daughter's room to search for the drugs. But the moment Ashley opened the door to Carly's room, everything changed. Carly had been seething with anger for weeks, her rebellious behavior growing more erratic. In the heat of the moment, she reached for the .357 Magnum that her mother had kept hidden under her mattress. As Ashley's footsteps echoed down the hallway, Carly took a deep breath, steadying her trembling hand. She moved silently to the top of the stairs, and with one cold decision, she raised the weapon. The door creaked open, and in a flash, Carly pulled the trigger. Ashley Smiley crumpled to the ground, her life extinguished in an instant. Carly stood frozen, watching the aftermath unfold. The house seemed to hold its breath before chaos erupted. Carly Gregg had always been a quiet and troubled teen. Raised by a dedicated schoolteacher, Ashley Smiley, Carly was expected to thrive in a loving home, but for years she battled inner turmoil. Her mother had always been there for her, offering support and guidance. But over time, Carly found solace in marijuana, using it to numb the pain of her insecurities and frustrations. Despite Ashley's attempts to rein in her daughter's erratic behavior, Carly was slowly slipping into a darker place. When her friends began to express concern over her drug use, Carly pushed them away, feeling misunderstood and isolated. At the same time, Ashley's relationships with her husband, Heath Smiley, and Carly's stepfather were becoming strained due to the increasing tension at home. Ashley, on the other hand, was the heart of the family, a hard-working schoolteacher, beloved by students and colleagues alike. Her nurturing nature was the anchor in the family, a figure of stability and love. Heath, her second husband, had been a supportive partner and father to Carly, despite the ongoing challenges. But nothing could prepare them for what was about to unfold. Witnesses would later reveal that Carly's close friend, Sarah, had noticed Carly's change in behavior. Sarah had become increasingly concerned as Carly's mental state seemed to deteriorate. But like others in Carly's life, she was unaware of the depth of Carly's pain. She was one of the first to hear from Carly after the shooting when Carly texted her, "I did it. I shot her. You need to come over." As Ashley walked into the house, her attention on the small tasks that filled her days, she had no inkling that she was stepping into a moment of unspeakable tragedy. Carly, who had been lurking behind her bedroom door, stepped out silently, gun in hand, eyes cold with determination. The sound of Ashley's footsteps grew louder as she approached Carly's room. When Ashley entered, Carly aimed the revolver and shot her mother point blank. The shot echoed through the house, piercing the silence and shattering lives in the blink of an eye. In a state of shock, Carly quickly grabbed Ashley's phone, sending a text to her stepfather, Heath. She pretended to be her mother and told him to come home. Seconds later, Heath returned home. As he stepped through the door, Carly fired another shot, aiming for him. But this time Heath fought back. In a desperate struggle, He managed to wrest the gun from Carly's hands. In a moment of clarity, he called 911, informing the operator of the horrifying situation. Witnesses in the neighborhood reported hearing gunshots, but it wasn't until the police arrived and began to investigate that they understood the gravity of the situation.
Does she have any kind of, what's her name? Carly Gregg. Carly Gregg? How old is she? 14. She'll be 15 next month. Okay.
Carly fled the scene with her friend Sarah and was arrested hours later. As the police worked their way through the evidence, Carly's confession came as a somber revelation. The security cameras in the living room had captured Carly's actions in chilling detail, confirming her guilt. But there was something more. Something that weighed heavily on the minds of all who knew her. The courtroom was filled with tension as the prosecution and defense clashed over Carly's fate. The prosecution argued that Carly's actions were deliberate and calculated, stating that she knew exactly what she was doing. This was not a crime of passion, the prosecutor told the jury. It was the calculated, cold-blooded murder of a mother by her own daughter. The defense, however, presented a different argument. They claimed that Carly was a victim of her mental illness, an illness that went unnoticed by her family, friends, and even Carly herself. This wasn't a crime of intent. This was a young girl trapped in her own mind, struggling with issues she couldn't control, the defense attorney argued. Carly didn't know what she was doing that day. She was not in her right mind. Ashley's sister, Rachel, took the stand, her voice breaking as she spoke about the loss of her sister. "Ashley was my best friend," Rachel said, tears streaming down her face. "She didn't deserve this. Carly didn't deserve this either. But we are left to pick up the pieces of what was destroyed that day." Carly sat quietly, her head bowed, as she listened to the emotional testimony. She had no words to offer, no way to explain the horror of her actions. When it was her turn to speak, she whispered, "I'm sorry. I never meant for this to happen. I love her. I didn't know what I was doing." The jury deliberated for hours, weighed down by the emotional toll of the case. When they returned, the room was deathly silent. "We, the jury, find the defendant Carly Madison Gregg guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment," the foreman said. The judge, her voice stern and solemn, sentenced Carly to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The words were final, ringing out in the courtroom, and the weight of them settled over Carly and her family like a heavy shroud. In the years to come, Carly would live the rest of her life in prison, a tragic reminder of the choices she had made in a moment of despair. But for the family of Ashley Smiley, the pain of that day would never fade. Carly's family, too, was left to grapple with the loss of a daughter and a sister who had spiraled beyond their reach. The tragedy that unfolded in that home would serve as a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the long-lasting consequences of a single irreversible decision. For the Smiley family, there was no closure, only the long, empty silence of a life taken too soon. Before we move further, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Your engagement means the world to us, and we're truly grateful for the support from our growing community. Every like, share, and comment spreads awareness of these case to.
You put the jelly on the glove. Is that when you use her hand to rub your penis?
Yeah.
I didn't know he could do that.
Oh my God, that was horrifying. That was horrifying.
I've never seen this before in my life.
I know I talked to you a little bit about what was on the phone.
No, I don't know anything that was on the phone.
All the phone contained images of Margaret before and after her death, as well as videos of your son with her.
2. Gavin Ramsey, Ohio, 2018. On the quiet streets of Medina, Ohio, the community was rocked by a crime so horrific it would forever leave a scar on its residents. 17-year-old Gavin Ramsey, known to his neighbors as a troubled young man, never imagined that a single unhinged act would change the course of his life and forever alter the life of 98-year-old Margaret Douglas. What began as a crime born of senseless violence would soon reveal the chilling depths of his dark and twisted actions. The morning of April 6, 2018 was deceptively calm. The birds chirped outside, and the sun filtered through the branches of the trees. Inside Margaret Douglas's modest home, everything seemed ordinary, except it wasn't. The once peaceful home had become the site of unspeakable brutality. Gavin, who had been lurking nearby, broke into the elderly woman's house through a rear door. It was a crime that would unfold with shocking speed. Margaret, a frail woman who had lived a long and peaceful life, was quietly at home when she unknowingly became the victim of a predator. Gavin's methodical actions were anything but spontaneous. He had carefully planned his attack. Armed with a series of cruel intentions, he strangled Margaret with her own hands, suffocating her as she fought desperately for air. He then proceeded to record the horrific crime on his phone, capturing moments of twisted satisfaction as he desecrated her body in the most vile way imaginable. When he finished, he stuffed her body in a closet, callously continuing his search for anything of value. Gavin Ramsey was no stranger to the authorities. Raised in a troubled home, he had struggled with mental health issues and a history of juvenile offenses. Friends and family described him as volatile, unpredictable, and often isolated. Though he had dreams of becoming a crime scene investigator, those around him saw an individual deeply disturbed by inner demons. Demons he could not escape. Gavin's fascination with death was not new. He had been known to talk about violence in unsettling ways, sometimes making jokes about murder and harm. Margaret Douglas, on the other hand, was a beloved 98-year-old woman who had lived a quiet life in Medina for decades. She had no enemies, no history of conflict. Her days were spent reading, gardening, and enjoying the simplicity of life. Her tragic death came as a shock to everyone who knew her, a woman who had never harmed anyone, whose only crime was living alone, vulnerable in her old age. Her family had always known her as a kind, gentle soul, and her loss shattered their hearts. The investigation began in earnest when a concerned relative of Margaret reported her missing after not hearing from her for several days. That led the police to her home, where the grim discovery would soon be made. The crime was carried out with cold precision. Gavin entered the house, and once inside, he found his victim in her living room. Margaret, who had been napping, was unaware of the danger lurking just a few feet away. In a shocking act of premeditation, Gavin grabbed her, strangled her with his bare hands, and left her body in a closet. He then took his phone, capturing every sickening detail of the crime. Gavin, caught up in his own fantasy of dominance and control, seemed to feel nothing as he filmed his horrific actions. The crime was discovered after a few days when family members became worried. They had not heard from Margaret and reached out to neighbors and local police for help. Upon arriving at her house, the police discovered a grisly scene. It wasn't long before they found Gavin's fingerprints and other physical evidence linking him to the crime. The community was stunned as news of Margaret Douglas's murder spread. The police acted quickly, piecing together the evidence that led them to Gavin. A DNA sample found at the scene, along with his cell phone records, would later confirm the chilling truth. Gavin had committed the crime. As officers questioned him, he initially denied involvement, but the evidence was irrefutable. When detectives examined his phone, they found the photos and videos of the crime, proving that Gavin had not only killed Margaret but had filmed his actions, seemingly with no remorse. Once arrested, Gavin's demeanor was eerily calm. The community was left in shock, trying to make sense of what had happened. Those who knew him were horrified, unable to reconcile the young man they once knew with the monster responsible for such an atrocity. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable as the prosecution and defense squared off. The prosecution painted a picture of a cold-blooded killer, someone who had plotted and executed a horrific murder without provocation. This wasn't a random act of violence. the prosecutor told the jury. This was the calculated and deliberate murder of an innocent woman. The defense, however, presented a different narrative. They argued that Gavin was mentally ill and did not fully understand the gravity of his actions. Gavin was a victim of his own mind, the defense attorney said. This was not premeditated. This was the result of a troubled young man who was suffering from untreated mental health issues. He needs help, not punishment. Expert witnesses testified about Gavin's mental state, with the defense attempting to convince the jury that he should not be held fully responsible for his actions due to his mental health. The prosecution, however, argued that despite his issues, Gavin was fully aware of what he had done, emphasizing the gruesome video footage and his calculated actions. Margaret's family, devastated by her death, spoke out during the trial. Her niece, tears streaming down her face, addressed the court. Margaret was a woman who touched so many lives. She never hurt anyone. How could this happen? How could a young man take her life so callously? The victim's family expressed their sorrow and outrage, asking for justice to be served. Gavin sat quietly, his face unreadable. When it was his turn to speak, he offered an apology that seemed too little, too late. "I don't know why I did it," he said, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone. I wish I could take it back." But the apology was hollow. His actions were unforgivable, and the family was not moved by his words. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder," the foreman declared, sending shockwaves through the courtroom. There was no question that Gavin Ramsey had taken an innocent life, and now justice would be served. Gavin was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge's voice echoed through the courtroom as she delivered the sentence. "The actions you have taken can never be undone. This is a crime of such brutality that no sentence can ever make up for the loss of Margaret Douglas. You will spend the rest of your life behind bars." Gavin Ramsey's life will be spent behind the cold, unforgiving walls of a prison cell. Margaret Douglas's family, however, will forever feel the absence of their loved one. Her kindness, her gentle spirit, will never be replaced. The community of Medina will never forget the shocking tragedy that unfolded in their midst, and for them, the memory of Margaret's life and her senseless death will haunt them for years to come. Case 3. Brian Kohei, Colorado, 2021. It was a morning like any other in a quiet Colorado suburb, but the stillness would soon be shattered by a discovery no parent could ever prepare for. 19-year-old Brian Kohei had turned a morbid fascination into a nightmarish reality. What started as curiosity about death and crime spiraled into a macabre act that would leave his family, neighbors, and authorities reeling. Human remains, including a severed head and hands, were found in his home. The Kohei family home, usually a place of routine and safety, became a scene of horror. Police arrived to find a grim tableau. A human head and hands wrapped in plastic bags, hidden in plain sight in his bedroom. The scent of decay mixed with the sterile odor of cleaning products gave the room an almost clinical eeriness. Items scattered across the room hinted at a disordered mind. Brian himself was outside in the backyard when officers arrived, initially calm but visibly nervous, aware that the police were about to discover the horrifying truth. 3 layers of gloves testified to the meticulous care Brian had taken to avoid leaving fingerprints, yet the evidence he left behind, and the body parts and his own admissions, was damning. Brian Kohei had been fascinated by death and serial killers from a young age. Family members described him as quiet and intelligent, yet increasingly withdrawn. He had expressed a morbid curiosity that for years had been dismissed as harmless teenage fascination. According to his mother, he often spoke about forensic science and even dreamed of working as a crime scene investigator. Yet beneath this veneer of normalcy was a dark obsession that would ultimately culminate in murder. The victim, 69-year-old Warren Barnes, was a respected elder in the community. Known for his kindness and quiet life, he had no enemies. To find his body desecrated in such a brutal way shocked neighbors and friends alike. Witnesses included Brian's mother, who first discovered the human remains, and the responding officers, who described in vivid detail the state of the bedroom and the shocking calmness of Brian during his interrogation. On March 1, 2021, Brian tracked down Warren Barnes. Motivated by a twisted fascination with death, Brian fatally stabbed him, an act he later described as channeling his interest in crime scene investigation. After killing Barnes, Brian took parts of the body back to his home. He meticulously wrapped the head and hands in plastic bags, storing them in his room. Throughout the crime, Brian displayed a methodical approach. He documented the crime in horrifying detail to satisfy his own obsession, and he later admitted he had planned to dispose of the remains. In interviews with police, Brian recounted the stabbing calmly, detailing how he stabbed Barnes multiple times in the neck and chest, then carved portions of his legs and abdomen, reflecting the premeditated and grisly nature of the crime. Brian's mother discovered the remains and immediately called 911. Officers arrived to a scene of chaos and confusion. Brian, outside in the backyard, cooperated with the police but revealed the horrific details of the murder during interrogation. Detectives carefully reconstructed the timeline. Brian had premeditated the act and followed through with chilling composure. He admitted to the murders without hesitation, describing his fascination with the killing in a detached, methodical tone. The local community was stunned. A young man from a quiet neighborhood had committed an act of unimaginable violence. The trial was a tense and dramatic affair. The prosecution painted Brian as a calculated, remorseless murderer whose obsession with death drove him to commit an atrocious crime. This was not a crime of passion, prosecutors emphasized. This was a deliberate act, executed with precision and intent. The defense argued that Brian's actions were influenced by mental health issues, including obsessive tendencies and a fascination with death that had gone unchecked for years. Expert witnesses testified to Brian's mental state, exploring whether his fascination with crime and morbid curiosity impaired his judgment or demonstrated underlying psychological illness. The prosecution countered that the planning, documentation, and deliberate concealment of the body proved full awareness and intent. Barnes's family delivered heartbreaking testimony. His children and siblings described his kindness, his routine life, and the devastation of losing him in such a violent and senseless way. "Our father was a man who spent his life helping others," said one of his children, voice breaking in court. "To have him taken in such a brutal way is something no family should endure." Brian, despite admitting to the acts, showed little visible remorse during court proceedings. When asked to speak, he described his actions as a culmination of his morbid curiosity, acknowledging the act but expressing confusion over his own motivations. His mother also testified, expressing shock, horror, and guilt at not recognizing the escalating danger of his obsession. After careful deliberation, the jury found Brian Cohey guilty of first-degree murder. The courtroom was silent as the foreman read the verdict, a formal recognition of the chilling reality of his crime. Brian was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The judge emphasized the deliberate, premeditated nature of the crime, noting the extreme cruelty involved in both the murder and the handling of the remains. Brian Cohey's actions shocked the Colorado community and left an indelible mark on the victim's family. His life would be spent behind bars, a stark reminder of the consequences of unchecked obsession and violent tendencies. Warren Barnes's family, though seeking closure, would forever carry the emotional scars of losing a loved one to such horrific violence. The Cohey case serves as a stark example of how morbid curiosity, left unchecked, can escalate into a devastating reality with irreversible consequences. Case 4. Jonathan Belton. It was the type of crime that would send shockwaves through the local community, a routine traffic stop that would lead to the senseless death of a police officer. On April 24, 2008, 16-year-old Jonathan Belton walked into the line of fire, his reckless decisions leading him to a violent confrontation that would change his life forever. But it wasn't just his life that would be altered. The life of Officer Mason Samborski, a beloved father and law enforcement officer, would be tragically taken in the blink of an eye. The night was cool, with a faint breeze sweeping through the streets of Carbondale, Illinois. Officer Mason Samborski, 35, had just finished his patrol shift and was parked near the side of the road when he noticed a car swerving erratically through the neighborhood. He quickly initiated a traffic stop, unaware that the young man behind the wheel would be anything but cooperative. The moment Jonathan Belton's car pulled over, the tension in the air thickened. As Officer Samborski approached, the lights of his police car flashing in the night, he was unaware of the desperate, violent streak that simmered within Belton. What started as a routine stop quickly spiraled into chaos. Closed in on him, Belton offered no resistance, his violent resolve having already been spent. He was arrested, bloodied and broken, but alive. The immediate aftermath of the shooting sent shockwaves through Carbondale. The entire town was in disbelief. Police officers, both local and from surrounding areas, flooded the scene, searching for any clues that would lead them to understand why such an act of violence had occurred. Residents came out of their homes, some offering condolences and others standing in stunned silence, unable to comprehend the senselessness of the crime. Inside the hospital, Officer Samborski was pronounced dead, his body a silent testament to the dangers police officers face every day. A wave of grief rippled through his colleagues and the local community, who had never imagined such a tragedy could strike so close to home. Belton's arrest brought a mixture of relief and confusion. While the community was thankful that he was apprehended, many were left asking why a young man would choose to murder a police officer in cold blood. The investigation revealed no obvious motive, but law enforcement speculated that Belton's disregard for authority and his attempt to flee were driven by a deep-seated anger and a desperate desire to escape his own life. The trial of Jonathan Belton began in the fall of 2008, and it was a tense affair from the start. The prosecution laid out its case with chilling clarity. Jonathan Belton had murdered Officer Samborski in cold blood. This was not an act of self-defense or an accidental discharge, the prosecutor argued. This was a premeditated act of violence. A young man, filled with rage, decided to take the life of an officer who was only doing his job. The defense, however, argued that Belton was a victim of his circumstances. They claimed that he had been under the influence of alcohol and drugs during the incident, and his actions were influenced by mental health issues that had gone untreated. This wasn't just a random killing, the defense attorney said. This is the result of a broken system that failed Jonathan Belton, a system that failed to help him before it was too late. Witnesses testified to Belton's troubled past, including his difficulties in foster care and his run-ins with the law. His defense attorneys painted a picture of a young man lost, a person who had never had a chance to thrive. But the prosecution remained firm. No amount of background could explain away the cold-blooded murder of a police officer. In the courtroom, the emotional weight of the trial was felt by all. Officer Samborski's widow, devastated by the loss of her husband, spoke through tears about her children and the life they would never have with their father. He was a good man. He was a good father. He didn't deserve this. No one deserves this. Jonathan Belton, sitting in the defendant's chair, could not meet her gaze. He was not the same defiant figure he had been the night of the crime. Instead, he appeared defeated, a broken young man now facing the full consequences of his actions. "I'm sorry for what I've done," Belton said quietly, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't take it back, and I know I can never make up for what I've done." After days of deliberation, the jury returned with their verdict: guilty of first-degree murder. The room went silent as the foreman read the verdict aloud. Jonathan Belton, who had shown little emotion throughout the trial, was now confronted with the full weight of his actions. The judge, solemn and stern, addressed Belton before sentencing him to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "You took the life of a man who dedicated himself to serving others," the judge said. "Your actions were senseless, and they will forever leave a void in this community." Jonathan Belton's life was irrevocably altered that night. The road that led him to murder was paved with neglect, anger, and frustration, but it did not excuse the life he took. His conviction and life sentence were a stark reminder of the consequences of violence and the devastating impact it has on not only the victim, but also on the perpetrator's life. For Officer Samborski's family, the pain of his loss would never fade, and his absence would be felt by every soul he had touched. The community would forever remember the sacrifice made by a police officer who had only been doing his job when his life was so senselessly taken. Case 5. Jacob Matthew Morgan, Mississippi, 2015. It was a quiet afternoon in the small town of Rock Hill, Mississippi, the kind of afternoon where nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until a tragic and senseless fire would turn a family's world upside down. Jacob Matthew Morgan, just 19 years old, made a decision that would alter the course of his life, and take the life of his 14-month-old half-brother, Joshua Hill. What seemed like a careless moment spiraled into a devastating tragedy, a crime that no one could have foreseen. The fire started in the bedroom where Joshua, only a baby, lay sleeping in his crib. It began small, a flicker in the dark corner of the room. Then it grew, slowly at first, feeding on the room's contents, the bedding, the toys, the furniture. But it didn't stop there. The flames crept toward the crib, moving closer to the child who was blissfully unaware of the danger. The house filled with the thick, suffocating smell of smoke, but it wasn't until the room was engulfed that anyone realized the magnitude of the fire. Jacob had walked away from the blaze without a second thought, never attempting to put it out or warn anyone. The fire raged, consuming the room where his half-brother slept. Meanwhile, Jacob moved to another part of the house, starting a second fire. With no concern for the child trapped inside, he let the flames grow uncontrollably, watching as the house burned. The horror of his actions didn't stop there. When the fire became too much to handle, Jacob calmly stepped outside, leaving the home to burn. Jacob Morgan had always been a troubled young man, carrying a deep-seated anger that often came to the surface in destructive ways. Raised in a home where emotional neglect seemed to run rampant, Jacob struggled with feelings of isolation, depression, and a need for attention. He often acted out, trying to express the turmoil inside him, but never quite understanding the weight of his actions. Joshua Hill, his 14-month-old half-brother, was a bright and happy child, beloved by his family. He was the kind of child who brought joy to everyone around him, his giggles and smiles brightening even the darkest days. His tragic death would not only devastate his parents, but also leave a permanent scar on his family. Jacob's mother and stepfather were the first to realize that something was horribly wrong. They noticed the smoke, heard the crackling of the flames, and rushed into the house in a panic. But by the time they reached the bedroom, it was too late. The baby's life had already been taken by the flames. Jacob Morgan had made the decision to start the fire deliberately, knowing that his half-brother was in the room. His choice to walk away without attempting to extinguish the flames without calling for help shows the depth of his indifference. In a stunning act of recklessness and malice, Jacob moved to the front room and set a second fire. As the flames spread, Jacob walked outside, seemingly unfazed by the destruction around him. The fire department was called, but the damage was already done. The child was dead, and the home was left in ruins. The immediate aftermath was chaotic and filled with disbelief. The authorities arrived to find a home ravaged by fire. The child, Joshua, was found in his crib, having succumbed to the flames. The family, heartbroken and horrified, struggled to comprehend what had just occurred. How could a young man, a brother, a son, stand by and let such a tragedy unfold? Jacob was arrested shortly after the incident, his actions too shocking to ignore. When questioned, he showed little remorse for the tragedy he had caused. The idea of responsibility never seemed to weigh heavily on his mind. In the courtroom, the tension was palpable. The prosecution presented a chilling case, emphasizing the intentional nature of Jacob's actions. They painted him as a cold-hearted individual who had intentionally set the fires with the sole purpose of causing destruction. This was no accident, the prosecutor said. Jacob Morgan's actions were deliberate, and he must be held accountable for what he did. The defense, however, tried to argue that Jacob's actions were driven by a troubled upbringing and a history of emotional instability. They painted a picture of a young man who had been neglected and who acted out of deep frustration. Jacob Morgan was a victim of his circumstances, the defense attorney argued. He was struggling with issues far beyond his control. Joshua's parents took the stand, their voices trembling with grief. "Our baby was everything to us. He had so much life to live," Joshua's mother said, her eyes filled with tears. "And now, he's gone because of something that should never have happened." Jacob sat in the defendant's chair, his head down. When asked if he wanted to say anything, he whispered an apology that seemed hollow and insincere. "I'm sorry," he muttered, but there was no emotion in his voice. He didn't seem to fully grasp the weight of the destruction he had caused. The jury deliberated for hours, but the evidence was clear. Jacob Morgan was convicted of first-degree murder and arson. The judge in sentencing him described the crime as one of unthinkable recklessness and heartbreaking malice. Jacob was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole, a stark reminder of the consequences of his actions. Jacob Morgan's life was irrevocably changed by his actions. The child he had killed would never grow up, never experience the world in the way he was meant to. The pain of losing him would haunt his family for the rest of their lives. Jacob, in his recklessness and indifference, had destroyed not only a young life, but his own as well. As for the Morgan family, they were left to pick up the pieces of a shattered home. The flames that had consumed their house would forever remind them of the young man who had walked away, leaving his brother to die, and the child who would never have a chance to grow up. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from. Your engagement means the world to us, and we're truly grateful for the support from our growing community. Every like, share, and comment spreads awareness of these. Case 7, Christian Fernandez, Florida, 2011. It was a normal morning in the small, quiet neighborhood of Jacksonville, Florida, but it would soon spiral into a nightmare. Christian Fernandez, a 12-year-old boy, never imagined that the single decision he made that day would forever change the course of his life and end the life of his 2-year-old half-brother, David. What seemed like a moment of rage and frustration would escalate into a senseless tragedy, a crime that would capture national attention and spark debates about the treatment of juvenile offenders. The day began like any other, but by the time the sun set, a tragic event would unfold in the Fernandez household. The scene that officers arrived to was unsettling. A 2-year-old boy, David, lying unconscious on the floor of the family home. He had been severely injured, showing signs of blunt force trauma to his abdomen and head. The child was quickly rushed to the hospital, but despite doctors' best efforts, he died from his injuries. In the home, there was a disturbing sense of chaos. The living room where the incident occurred had signs of a struggle. The toys and scattered belongings of a young child lay everywhere, a stark contrast to the violence that had unfolded moments before. Christian, appearing anxious and distressed, was at the scene when authorities arrived. Christian Fernandez had a troubled upbringing. Raised in an unstable home, he had experienced neglect and violence from a very young age. His mother, who struggled with her own demons, had been unable to provide him with the consistent care and support he needed. At 12 years old, Christian was already familiar with the police and had previously been in trouble for minor offenses. His anger, frustrations, and emotional struggles were often evident, though no one could predict the explosive consequences that would follow. David, the victim, was a vulnerable, innocent child who had no way of protecting himself from the trauma he would experience that day. He was the son of Christian's mother and had been living in the same home. His short life was filled with love and care from those around him, but that all came to an abrupt and violent end at the hands of his half-brother. Witnesses to the crime included Christian's mother, who had been in the home when the incident occurred but was not present in the immediate area when David was attacked. Her statements during the investigation revealed her shock at the violence her son had inflicted on his younger brother. The crime itself unfolded in a moment of uncontrolled rage. Christian had been upset with his younger brother David, and became enraged when David, in his toddler innocence, would not stop crying. Christian's emotions, often volatile due to the instability of his home life, reached a breaking point that day. Christian pushed David down onto the floor, repeatedly striking him in an attempt to silence the cries. His actions were a chaotic mix of anger and frustration, directed at someone who could not possibly understand the situation. The violence escalated quickly. Christian inflicted blunt force trauma to David's head and abdomen, resulting in severe internal injuries. The moment the child fell unconscious, Christian's rage turned to panic. His reaction was not one of remorse or understanding of what he had done, but one of fear. He ran to his mother, telling her that David had fallen but the damage was already done. By the time paramedics arrived, David's injuries were too severe to recover from. The house was immediately flooded with law enforcement and emergency responders. Christian's mother, initially unaware of the full extent of what had happened, was devastated upon realizing the gravity of the situation. David, her youngest child, had been taken from her, and her oldest son, Christian, was at the center of it all. Christian's behavior after the incident was erratic. When questioned by police, he was unable to fully comprehend the severity of his actions. The young boy seemed confused, overwhelmed by the consequences of his actions, but showing little to no emotion about the life he had taken. The shockwaves from the crime reverberated through the community. A young child had been murdered by his own half-brother, someone just a few years older, but still a child. The case sparked immediate interest as authorities sought to understand how a pre-adolescent could commit such a violent act. The trial was an emotional and complex one. Christian's defense attorneys argued that he was a product of his environment, a child who had been raised in an abusive and neglectful home. They presented evidence of his troubled background, citing the emotional and psychological toll of his experiences. The defense team argued that Christian's actions were not premeditated, but rather the result of a tragic outburst of violence, likely exacerbated by his environment and his inability to control his anger. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that Christian's actions were not merely a momentary lapse in judgment, but a deliberate and violent attack on a defenseless child. They emphasized the extent of David's injuries, which suggested a more intentional and brutal act, rather than an accidental fall. The prosecution contended that Christian's violent tendencies, already evident in his behavior, had culminated in this tragic event. Witnesses took the stand, including Christian's mother, who spoke of her son's struggles but was unable to fully explain the extent of his violent outburst. The prosecution used her testimony to show how Christian's behavior had escalated over time, resulting in the murder of his half-brother. During the trial, emotional testimonies from David's family highlighted the unbearable pain they had endured. David's family spoke of the vibrant and joyful child that he had been, and how their lives had been shattered in an instant by Christian's actions. "We lost more than a son that day," David's father said, his voice breaking in court. "We lost a piece of ourselves." Christian, sitting in the defendant's chair, barely made eye contact with anyone in the courtroom. When it was his turn to speak, he expressed deep remorse for his actions. "I'm sorry for what happened," Christian whispered, his voice low and filled with emotion. "I didn't mean to hurt David." However, the sincerity of his apology was questioned, as many believed that he did not fully grasp the gravity of what he had done. His family, too, was left in turmoil, with his mother devastated by the loss of her youngest child, and the realization that her oldest son was responsible for it. The jury deliberated for several hours before returning with a verdict. Christian Fernandez was convicted of second-degree murder and aggravated child abuse. Due to his age, Christian was not eligible for the death penalty, but he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. The judge, while acknowledging the tragic circumstances of Christian's upbringing, emphasized the need for justice for David. Christian's sentence was a reminder of the devastating consequences of his violent actions. The court's decision left many wondering whether a young child, who had suffered so much, could ever be rehabilitated, or if the horrors of his past would follow him for the rest of his life. Christian Fernandez's case stands as a tragic example of how unresolved trauma and neglect can manifest in unimaginable ways. The brutal murder of David Fernandez left a permanent scar on the family and the community. For Christian, the road to understanding his actions and the gravity of his crime will be long, filled with the weight of guilt and the burden of responsibility. David's family, meanwhile, will forever mourn the loss of their young son, whose life was taken far too soon. Christian's actions not only destroyed the life of an innocent child, but also shaped the course of his own life in a way that no one could have anticipated. Case 8. Cyntoia Brown, Tennessee, 2004. The night of August 6, 2004, started like any other in the city of Nashville, Tennessee. A 16-year-old girl named Cyntoia Brown, caught in a life of desperation and abuse, made a decision that would forever alter the course of her life. She was a victim of trauma, manipulated and coerced by predators, but that night, her fate intertwined with that of 43-year-old Johnny Allen. Cyntoia pulled the trigger, ending Allen's life. But what followed was a tragic and complicated case that would raise difficult questions about self-defense, juvenile justice, and the treatment of young women who had been forced into lives of violence. The crime took place in a small, dimly lit house on the outskirts of Nashville. Johnny Allen had picked Cyntoia up earlier that evening, offering her $150 for sex. Cyntoia had been lured into this life after years of neglect, abuse, and manipulation. As a victim of sexual exploitation, she had little choice but to comply with men who sought her out for sex. Allen, a man with a history of criminal behavior, took her to his home. Inside the house, the atmosphere was tense. Cyntoia, already used to feeling cornered and vulnerable, began to feel more uneasy as the night wore on. Allen, who had been drinking, began to act erratically, making Cyntoia feel uncomfortable and fearful. She later testified that she was terrified of Allen, who had begun to make unwanted sexual advances and had become increasingly aggressive. She felt that she was in immediate danger. In the moments before the shooting, Cyntoia believed that Allen was going to harm her. As he lay in bed, she grabbed a gun that he kept in the room and in a swift and panicked decision, she shot him in the back of the head. The bullet pierced through Allen's skull and he fell immediately, dead. The violence was sudden and the room fell eerily silent. Cyntoia, terrified, fled the scene. She later confessed to the police, explaining that she shot Allen in self-defense, fearing that he was going to harm her. After the killing, she took Allen's wallet and other personal items before leaving the house, shaken and scared. The scene she left behind was a grisly one, a man's life taken in the blink of an eye, and a young girl running for her life. Cyntoia Brown had lived a turbulent life before the shooting. Born to a mother struggling with addiction, Cyntoia was placed into foster care at a young age. She had a troubled upbringing, marked by neglect, abuse, and a lack of stability. As she grew older, she found herself being lured into a life of sex work, a result of manipulation by older men, including a man named Cutthroat, who forced her into prostitution. Johnny Allen, the victim, was a 43-year-old man with a criminal background. He had a history of violence and had been involved in previous illegal activities. Allen picked up Cyntoia, seeing her as an object to satisfy his desires, with no regard for the trauma she had endured in her short life. The witnesses in the case were few. Cyntoia's confession to the police was the main source of information about what had transpired that night. Her testimony about her fear of Allen and the events leading up to the shooting were crucial in understanding her mindset at the time of the crime. Cyntoia's fear of Johnny Allen was not unfounded. She later testified that she believed Allen had intended to sexually assault her, even though he had already paid for sex. She recounted how he had made advances and become increasingly aggressive. In a moment of panic, Cyntoia grabbed the gun and shot him. The violence was swift. Cyntoia's emotions were a blur of fear, anger, and confusion, as she found herself caught in a situation that spiraled out of control. As she fled the scene, she didn't realize the full extent of what had just happened, but her instincts to protect herself had led to a tragic outcome. She took nothing but Allen's belongings and fled, leaving behind the scene of the crime that would haunt her for years to come. After the shooting, Cyntoia went to a friend's house, but the reality of what she had done began to settle in. The fear and guilt were overwhelming. She had just killed a man who had picked her up for sex. but the trauma of her life had led her to a breaking point. The authorities quickly tracked her down, and Cyntoia was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. At the time of her arrest, Cyntoia was a child, just 16 years old. Yet, she was treated as an adult in the justice system, facing a lifetime in prison without parole. The case quickly garnered attention from the media, with many questioning whether the young girl, who had been sexually exploited and abused, deserved to be treated as a criminal, or whether she was simply another victim of a broken system. The trial of Cyntoia Brown was a highly emotional and complex legal battle. The prosecution argued that Cyntoia's actions were premeditated, pointing to the fact that she had taken Alan's wallet after shooting him. They presented her as a cold-blooded killer who had taken the life of an innocent man without cause. This was not an act of self-defense, the prosecutor argued. This was murder. The defense, however, presented a different story. They argued that Cyntoia had been a victim of abuse and trauma for much of her life, and that her actions were a direct result of her circumstances. They painted a picture of a young girl who had been manipulated, abused, and abandoned by those who should have protected her. She was a 16-year-old child, trying to survive in a world that had treated her with nothing but cruelty, the defense attorney said. Experts in the fields of psychology and trauma testified on Cyntoia's behalf, explaining how the abuse and manipulation she had endured had affected her mental state. The defense argued that the system had failed her at every turn, and that she was not a murderer, but a girl who had acted out of fear and desperation. During the trial, Johnny Allen's family spoke about their loss. His mother, in particular, expressed her grief, struggling to understand why her son had been killed. He wasn't a saint, but he didn't deserve this, she said, her voice filled with sorrow. Cyntoia, for her part, seemed truly remorseful. "I'm so sorry for what happened," she said in court, her voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt anyone. I just wanted to survive." Her apology was heartfelt, but it was clear that the road to redemption would not be easy. Cyntoia Brown was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The verdict sparked outrage, with many believing that Cyntoia's past trauma should have been taken into account when determining her sentence. Despite her age, she was tried as an adult and her fate seemed sealed. But her case also sparked a nationwide debate about the treatment of juveniles in the criminal justice system, particularly those who had been victims of abuse and exploitation. Activists and advocates for juvenile justice rallied around her case, calling for a re-examination of how young offenders are treated. Cyntoia's case became a symbol of both the failures and potential for change within the justice system. After serving 15 years in prison, Cyntoia's sentence was commuted, and in 2019 she was granted clemency by Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam. Her release marked a turning point, not only in her life but in the ongoing fight for juvenile justice reform.